Let's go over food preservation. So there are several reasons why you want to preserve food. This is more long-term storage, so you would have to be in an area for a while to make containers or have access to commercial containers in order to preserve food. In most cases, now you can make your own container like we talked about in the last lecture, but in general, you're going to have to be there for a while to have the resources needed to be able to preserve food. So long-term storage, we're going to be there for a while. We're not going to move around and forage. We're going to take the resources around us and try to preserve them. Some foods are easier to store than others because of how they grow and what they're contained in. So like nuts, obviously easy to store. Just need a nice, dry, dark place to store them in. But other food sources like meat, especially if you're hunting, so this references back to trapping, we've really got to worry about bacterial contamination on a lot of meat sources and even plant sources. So especially sprouting foods or foods that get really moist are prone to bacterial and fungal contamination. So ergot would be a fungal growth that we're really concerned about on food. And bacterial growth would be something like E. coli, any type of bacteria like Listeria that could cause foodborne illness. If you preserve foods, it makes it a little bit easier to transport those, especially if you have to move long distances. This is often the case with individuals that still hunt as a means of procuring food, but they need to still forage and move from location to location. By drying that meat or drying the food source, they're able to store it. It makes it lighter weight, and it allows them to transport it without risk of, or at least lowers the risk of contamination. And again, like I said before, it allows individuals to stay in one area for a longer period of time. So if we're talking about grains that are being stored, or even taking perishable vegetables or meat sources and being able to preserve them for a long period of time, you don't have to hunt as often, so you don't have to move around as much and follow the food sources. You can collect the ones that grow in the area that you're in and stay there for a long period of time. And this is really how civilizations begin to develop. So a lot of anthropologists look at this and look at the change in human behavior when we went from foraging, hunter-gatherers, and we started preserving food sources. And really, as soon as that started happening, along with farming, we started staying in locations, and civilizations sprang up from that because people could keep food sources for a long period of time. Foodborne illness, so we need to reduce the possible contamination. So E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, even botulism, which happens as a result of a toxin from bacteria. These are all foodborne illnesses we really want to be concerned about with plant sources and especially meat sources. So microbes or bacteria can create the ones that form or make or result in botulism. Boiling point of water will not kill them directly, so you need to get a little bit higher level. So what we're looking for is 250 degrees for 5 minutes or longer in order to kill the bacteria that would increase the risk of botulism. Moisture is a big issue, especially when you're trying to store food, because it allows microbes to flourish. It allows fungus to grow, and a lot of foodborne illnesses are the result of moisture or high amounts of concentration of moisture in foods that allow those to develop. pH in food preservation. So microorganisms tend to have a neutral pH like we do. So our blood pH is around 7.2, 7.3. Same thing with microorganisms. They like a fairly neutral pH in a similar range that we have. Once you get below a pH of 4, a lot of microorganisms will be killed off. And so that's the reason like pickling is conducive to food preservation, because it kills off a lot of the bacteria. But there are some yeast and molds that can tolerate lower pH levels. So when you're fermenting fruits into alcohol, there are some yeasts that can deal with the high acid concentrations. Well, I should say high acid, low pH. A lot of people get that confused. So the lower pH levels of fruits that are being fermented, there are a lot of yeast that can tolerate that, and they start using them as a food source. So low pH is commonly used to preserve foods. High pH is now being used also to sanitize certain areas. I didn't finish my thought when I typed that out, but high pH is now, they're coming up with solutions to clean different places that process foods, and they're finding that it is pretty reliable. Instead of using bleach and these toxic chemicals, they're going with this alkaline solution, and the research is showing that it's pretty beneficial, or just as beneficial, if not more beneficial, because it doesn't have all those toxic compounds, so it wouldn't be harmful to humans. So to clean facilities. I know I spelled that wrong, but all right. Factors affecting food spoilage: pH. So we can drop pH and slow foods from spoiling, give them a longer shelf life. Obviously, taking water out of foods, dehydrating foods, and that helps give them a longer shelf life because it's harder for fungal growth, just like we talked about. Oxygen, a lot of these microbes need oxygen. Taking that out of the mix will slow food spoilage. And then the structure of the food. So is it ground up into a flour? Food products that have been processed and have a lot of surface area are more prone to degrading or food spoilage. Yeah. Are they like nuts, like pecans and walnuts, have this hard shell? Most of your nuts will have that shell that protects them. Well, if you're going to store them, keep them in that shell. They'll last longer. And you have some vegetables that have an outer covering. As soon as that's cut open, it increases or speeds up the food spoilage, so it happens sooner. So pH, most bacteria are inhibited by low pH. And we talked about yeast and molds being able to tolerate low pHs. Water, so if we can take out the water, it can slow microbial growth. It doesn't guarantee that it's going to stop. And so drier foods, a lot of times, think of raisins. Raisins are dry, they don't spoil, but they do have yeast on the outside. And that's a natural yeast that you can use to actually create a starter bread for sourdough breads. So with that dry yeast, once you introduce moisture, that yeast will take off. Oxygen. So microorganisms require oxygen to grow and multiply. So when you put them into a hypoxic condition, an anaerobic condition, like lactic acid fermentation, it can slow the growth and inhibit their growth. The structure of food, we just talked about that. Grinding foods increases surface area. So if you damage the foods, you need to cover them up in some way to increase that protective covering. Some foods have natural protection built in. So cranberries have an acid built in that's antifungal. Egg whites have an enzyme in them that has antibacterial properties. Mullein has an insecticide built into it. So not that you eat mullein, but it is a medicinal plant, but it has a rotenone in there, which is actually a pretty strong insecticide, but people smoke it. But anyway, getting back to foodborne illness, methods to prevent it. Now, these are just general classifications. These aren't actual methods more than they're actually, well, they are methods to prevent it, but they are the most general description of those methods. So dehydration, then there are a lot of different forms of dehydration. And then you have temperature. Obviously, freezing something will slow microbial growth and allow it to preserve the food. That's the reason we have freezers and refrigerators. And that we're dropping the temperature, slowing that microbial growth. And then on the other end of the spectrum, heat will obviously kill things off, and ideally above 250 degrees so we can kill most of the bacteria. Increasing salinity, so the salt content in fluid can help preserve. You can pack meat in salt, so there's a lot of different methods. Using salt. Salt can actually be used along with acid to pickle things. You can use acid alone, you can use salt alone. Normally, if you're going to use salt alone, we're dealing with lactic acid fermentation, and the same thing applies to pickling when you're increasing the acidity of something. So they're both related. That's why they are also used in conjunction. So high acid means low pH. High alkalinity means a higher pH. So outside that normal neutral range. So primitive methods of food preservation. So we have different methods of dehydration. We have different methods of smoking. You have salt curing. You have pickling. And then you have different types of fermentation. So we're going to talk about each one of those. So different methods of primitive dehydration would be sun drying. So you may have seen on TV before, especially with hatch chilies, a lot of times they sun dry those. And really, if they're in a container where there's no airflow and it's just using solar heat, then that is just sun drying. But often you're using a combination of sun drying and air drying. So somebody may mention air drying, but really you're also getting some sun drying effect by hanging them out in the heat of the day. And these also require certain environmental conditions. Then you have cold drying, which is really close to hot smoking. So cold drying, you're getting the meat or the plant really close to the coals of a fire and using that to take the moisture out. And then you have oven drying, which it can be considered primitive because you can make your own primitive bricks or your own primitive ovens out of natural resources, out of different forms of clay. And so there are different ways to make natural ovens. Probably the most common primitive method would be using cob, making a cob oven. It can handle those high heats and allow you to dehydrate that way. It's pretty much baking is what you're looking at. Sun drying we talked about, so open sun, but we really want to contain it unless we're going to do a combination of sun drying and air drying. The problem with it is it's safer in low humidity arid environments. The same thing for air drying. We want low humidity arid environments. Both of these run the risk, and they're often used in conjunction, but both of them run the risk of insects and humidity playing a role. Air drying doesn't work in you can dehydrate, but not dehydrate the food source sufficiently in humid environments. There's just too much moisture. If you have hot enough sun, it still needs to be arid. It needs to be low humidity for those two to be safely used. But you're still concerned with insects. So biltong is a form of beef jerky made in South Africa, and it is air dried and sun dried. It's really a combination of the two. So air drying methods, beef jerky can be air dried. Traditionally, it's a combination of sun and air, or heat and air. And then you have biltong, which is just a dried form of cured meat. Peppers can be done that way. Fruits and vegetables can also be dried using air drying, cold drying, putting them above the heat of the coals. We talked about really similar to hot smoking. The main difference here is cold drying, you're not regulating temperature, so you can get that meat really dry, almost where it's hard to even eat. It's so dry, like beef jerky dry or drier. But hot smoking, when we get to that, think of cooking a brisket. You're really controlling the temperature range so that you don't over dry the meat. Oven drying, and we talked about using cob or some sort of clay mix to make an oven, a primitive oven. You can do that as well. Smoking, you have cold smoking, hot smoking, and with smoking, there's a big concern right now because the World Health Organization released this research, and it classified processed meats, especially meats that underwent curing, fermenting, and smoking. Smoking was one of the big concerns as being carcinogenic and a high level carcinogen. So if you're smoking meats or eating a lot of different smoked meats, very often you might want to look into the research on that. So cold smoking adds flavor but doesn't fully cook the food. You're cold smoking for at least 12 to 48 hours. So your heat source would be way far away from where the smoke comes out. So you would have to make some sort of chimney. This can be done primitive. There are primitive methods of cold smoking. And so you make this tunnel, typically by digging into the ground. And so your pit's a little bit lower so the smoke will rise from that pit, go through this hollowed out tunnel into your smoke box, which is 6 to 8 feet away, giving the smoke time to cool off. And you keep temperatures of 68, 70 degrees, somewhere right around in that range, degrees Fahrenheit, and keep a lot of smoke on it. A lot of times hides are smoked this way too, after they're brain tanned. So you take brains and mush it up and get those oils on it from the brains. They'll smoke them, so they'll wrap them in around like a small teepee, and they'll have the smoke come up through the central part of that teepee, but they'll cold smoke it so they don't damage the skin and don't dry it out too fast, because hot smoking would not work for skin preservation, like if you're trying to make skins for clothing or for other purposes. Hot smoking, think of a brisket. That's the easiest way. You know how everybody has those cookers. You've got to really regulate the temperature. So we're looking at 176, 175 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, a long cooking time. So one of those individuals will cook overnight, like you'll see people that are really into barbecuing spend a lot of time on their cookers. And it's similar to cold drying, but you're regulating temperature. That's the biggest difference. And they tend to have a lot of, or retain a lot of the moisture within them. So something that's hot smoked is not going to last for a long period of time. It's really more of a form of cooking. Yes, it will preserve it for a few days, but not as long as cold smoking. Cold smoking in conjunction with other curing methods works really good. So typically you would cure first and then cold smoke, because curing meat before it's smoked allows the smoke to kind of penetrate and get further into the tissue. So you want to cure first, then smoke. Salt curing, probably one of the oldest methods of curing meats. So you can do this with fish. You can do it with any source of meat, really. Salt curing hams are really popular here in the United States. Up until the turn of the 20th century, this was the primary means of preserving meat. So they didn't have refrigeration. So what did they do? They packed it in salt, and it works really well. So it inhibits microorganisms. It works the same way that they're doing kimchi, except you're doing this with meat as opposed to a plant source. But it allows the salt to kind of pull the moisture out, and the salinity also kills off any microbes. They just can't live in those conditions. Now, there may be some sort of extremophile, which is a microorganism that can live in extreme conditions that might be toxic to us, but I don't know of any off the top of my head. Pickling, probably the most common form of food preservation most people eat on a regular basis. in the United States. So acid pickling, it can also be done with salt or a briny solution. Normally, in the U.S., it's a combination of the two. So think of a dill pickle. That would be your best example. So let me write it down there. I think I've done that on another slide, but I just want to write it in so I don't forget. Dill pickle. So we have some antimicrobial spices that go in, like dill, some other flavors, but really what's preserving the food is the acid that you put in there. Traditionally vinegar, but you can use lemon or lime juice, and salt or briny solution, or one or the other. And we want that acidity to be under a certain percent, and we really want this brine to be 20% salt in the mixture. Acid pickling, pH lower than 4.6. It kills most bacteria. Lime or lemon can be used, just like I said before. Vinegar. Oh, that's where I wrote it. I knew I wrote it somewhere. And this would be a form of acid pickling. So here I'm just talking about acid pickling. Lactic acid fermentation can really be considered a form of pickling. You've got sauerkrauts and kimchi are probably the two most popular versions of this that most Americans will eat. So it's natural fermentation at room temperature. You got to be careful with this. I did this one time and had I put my lids on a little too tight and didn't allow them to breathe, and they exploded. So any form of fermentation is going to build up some gases. So I was younger, didn't really know what I was doing, and it exploded. I had a cousin one time doing alcohol fermentation, and he did the same thing, and his built up CO2 and exploded in his closet. So, but this is working off lactic acid. So the lactic acid builds up because of bacteria producing it, and that's really the acidity that preserves the food and keeps any other microbes from forming. And then the container doesn't have to be sterile. So I like to sterilize my containers before using it, but it doesn't have to be. And it's just for me an added measure of safety. It freaks me out not sterilizing my containers. And this could be done in a quart jar. This could be done in a ceramic jar that you make. If it's low earthenware, you got to be real careful with storing stuff in low earthenware because it's porous and it'll soak up a lot of the contents. And then when you open it and the acidity level goes down, you can build up bacteria in those pores and not realize it. So you wouldn't want to reuse a low earthenware container for any type of fermentation or storage for a long period of time. It's a one-time use. Okay, alcohol fermentation is probably what everybody is most familiar with when they think of fermentation. So the yeast is breaking down glucose or some form of sugar, and then they produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. And that's the reason my cousin's container exploded, because the carbon dioxide built up and pressure built up and it blew up. So here's where alcohol fermentation really comes in useful in a survival situation. Obviously, you wouldn't want to sacrifice all those good fruits and stuff. But if you had excess fruits that were going to go bad, they're going to ferment anyway, you might as well get some calories from it. So for 1 gram of fat, which is how we store our calories in our body, there's 9 kcals. Well, the next one that's close to it in caloric content is alcohol. So there's 7 kcals in 1 gram of alcohol, whereas there's only 4 kcals in protein and carbohydrates. So there's a lot of energy in alcohol. It's the reason people get fat when they drink it, because they're taking in all this excess alcohol. It's one reason they get fat, and they don't burn it off and it gets stored as fat. It's calorically dense, but the problem is it's not necessarily nutrient dense. So you're not getting as much nutrients as you would get from that fresh fruit. But like I said, if it's something that's going to go bad and you have no other way to store it for long term, alcohol fermentation would be the way to go. It would be one of the methods that could be done simply and in a primitive manner. A lot of times, fruits will ferment and produce alcohol without even being collected together. there's these birds in Australia where they could not figure out why they were acting so funny and why they were passing out but then recovering and what was happening. And they were eating fermented fruit. And they were getting drunk on it. And then they were passing out. So anyway, I put some videos on here. Now, obviously, if you're going to do this, you need to be of legal age to make or drink alcohol. But I did this really more for information purposes, just showing how easy it could be done. I don't want y'all doing this in class, but it's just so you could see the process and get a good visual. So prickly pear wine, I've got a bunch of different natural, wild, edible wines that I've made. So prickly pear is one. Mustang grapes is another really good one that I've made. So I've experimented with a lot of these natural fruits. Some are better than others. And I've got a lot of videos. This is just one of the more popular ones. Natural yeast. We talked about how to use the natural yeast because raisins were dry. And you could get this from just native wild Mustang grapes. When they dry, they're going to have a natural yeast on them. But they are super acidic. But these yeast can flourish in that acidity. And you can make a natural yeast from raisins. That's probably one of the easiest ways. Even the Mustang grape leaf, if you turn it over, there's this white coating on the underside. It has a natural yeast within it. And here's some more natural yeast wine where I just dropped it in, and for some reason it was a really robust yeast. And it did not want to die off. It just kept wanting to ferment. So really strong. I made that one from raisins. Sourdough bread starter, again made from yeast from raisins. And then sourdough bread made from that yeast where I made a starter dough. Canning, probably the most popular method now, modern method, but it can also be done primitively. Water bath canning, that's for high acid foods. So like if you were canning jams and jellies, they tend to be high acid foods. Those are okay just to use water bath canning. Or if you've got a low acid food, let's say like green beans is a popular one. Well, let's say okra. All right, so okra is a popular one. Okra is a low acid food. I can't just water bath can it without adding some sort of acid or briny solution. So most of the time, if you're going to see okra canned, and they didn't use a pressure canner to do it, it's going to be pickled okra. And that's why they would pickle it, because it's a low acid food, and they add the acid to it. So they can use water bath canning, which is a cheaper method. Now, pressure canning is for low acid foods. So something like green beans, where you don't really want to change the flavor by adding acid or a lot of salt. Pressure canning is the way to go. And pressure canning, you want to get it to around 15 psi. And that for about, I do mine for 90 minutes. That can be overkill for some. But what you want is a consistent heat all the way through. And I'm trying to get above 250 degrees. The reason you would pressure can is because boiling water is only going to get to boiling temperature at sea level, which is not high enough to kill off, especially the bacteria that causes the toxin that results in botulism. But pressure canning can get you above that 250 degrees. You keep it at 15 psi. As pressure goes up, so does temperature. And then I like to just be safe and do mine for about 90 minutes. I do the same thing for when I'm trying to grow mushrooms. So if I'm trying to grow baby bellas at home or oyster mushrooms, then I use pressure canning to make sure there are no spores in my growing medium. So I put my growing medium in canning jars, and they have a self-healing port on top where I can inoculate the jars without opening them. And I put whatever growing medium's best. So a lot of your oyster mushrooms and mainly your baby bellas grow really well out of any kind of wood chips or manure. Those are really good. And so you want to sterilize them, making sure no other poisonous mushrooms got in there. After you sterilize them, then you can inoculate them, but I use pressure canning. And since it's such dense material, I need really consistent heat to heat it all the way through. If you were to put that material in an oven and try to can it without using some sort of water source at a really high temperature, you can get your oven up to 450 degrees. The problem is it won't be a consistent heat because air is not as dense as water, so it won't hold that heat right up against the container. And it more than likely will not kill off everything in that jar, and you're going to have contaminants. Another problem with growing mushrooms is if there are any spores in there, you'll see them grow before whatever you're trying to grow starts to develop. So you're looking for the mycelium of your baby bellas, and you'll start to see these little green spots. So a mold got in there. Your molds will often grow before your mushroom mycelium will take off. Your household molds are a lot more competitive. And then here's some references. So probably some of the best references were from World Health Organization. A lot of these ones from Wikipedia reference World Health and some of the food safety and these other more reliable sources.